He really looked like a mean, strongest Japanese samurai.
Really?
Yes.
But you said he was hairy. And,
oh, yes.
And Japanese are not a hairy people.
No. He might have a little bit different type of blood in his.
Like those of African heritage, the Japanese have suffered from Hollywood distortions about their society. Uchida says the shogun rulership meant more than battles and war. The last dynasty lasted 15 generations, more than 265 years. Its leaders gave Japan the stability necessary to begin the beautiful traditions of ocha and ikebana, the tea ceremony and flower arranging. Shogun society also established the Japanese Code of Honor.
Especially like a Tokugawa period, Tokugawa Shogun time, was a very peaceful, went almost no war during 264 years. Therefore, in the local area, they created many unique Japanese cultures. For instance, well known today, ikebana, flower arranging, Japanese tea ceremony, ocha, many other type of things. When Japanese samurais go to the battlefield and when they fight, when they pulled out the sword, they say, my name is who is, and I'm from this family, and I belong to which shogun. And so they know they can identify that way, and then they respect each other, and they fight. It's a lot of honor to do that so. But then after that Westerners, or especially the Europeans, brought guns to Japan, and the war system or fighting system totally changed. Before you shouting, you got shot. You'll be dead. And so there's no honor or anything like that. And then I think a culture had a really big shock. And then Tokugawa Shogun 15th returned his power back to the Meiji Emperor. And then Japan started moving toward very rapidly to adjusting the Western culture.
Okay, and that basically started in 1867, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Modern anthropologists have started to admit to themselves and the rest of the world that their ethnocentrism has skewed history, not only for those of African descent, but also for all non-white, non-Western civilizations and cultures.
To see African or any history clearly, you must remove the archaic attitude of 18th and 19th century Western colonialism. Then, if you choose to look at world history differently, you start to see startling information. African researcher Runoko Rashidi.
So even in the westernmost extension of Asia, you have an African element. You have the African element that we spoke about in China and Japan. But you also have this huge group of black people in India, where they still remain today. Most of them are called Dravidians. And then also it's very important to point out that the first civilization that anybody can clearly identify in Asia is called Sumer. Wow. Took place in Iraq. And if you looked at it on a map, you could trace it from the base of the Persian Gulf north to the city of Baghdad, about a distance of 300 miles. Now, this is the first civilization in Asia. Some people would argue it's the first civilization in the world. I don't believe that. I'm sure that the Egyptian civilization is, or Tasseti, or the Nile Valley civilization.
Right.
But I guess it's become a standard racist argument that civilization begins in Sumer. But even if it did begin in Sumer, you're still talking about black people.
Why?
The Sumerians called themselves the black-headed people to distinguish themselves from all other people.
Doesn't that simply mean their hair?
No. It said black-headed, and you could argue that point, but then you have to put it in conjunction with other things. Now, the skeletal remains have been removed from most of the major royal cemeteries in early Sumer. For example, you have one in a city called Ur, that's mentioned in the Bible as Ur the Chaldees. That's where Abraham was supposed to come from. You have them in a place called Ubad. You have them in a place called Uruk. You have them in Jimnit Nasser. You have them in a place called Kish. Now, all these major skeletal remains are identical with the skeletal remains of African people in other parts of Africa, particularly Egypt. And we know the Egyptians were black. We know that they were black people because their oldest deity in Sumer was known as Anu. Anu was a name that you find with thriving black populations all over the world. For example, the Nubians, or the Sudanese people that produced the Egyptian civilization, call themselves the Anu Seti. In Egypt, you have a group of people called the Anu. The earliest Egyptians are called Anu, A-N-U. Even in Arabia, you have the Anu. So you have these Anu populations wherever you find black people. You have the fact that they worship female goddesses. This is totally unlike European and Mongoloid civilizations because their emphasis was patriarchal. In Africa, you have a matriarchal, a matrilineal philosophy. So you have the skeletal remains, which are identical to other African people. You have the fact that they call themselves the black-headed people to distinguish themselves from other people. You have eyewitness accounts of people that went to Sumer and described these people as having black skins and woolly hair. You have the worship of female deities. You have the oldest deity being Anu, and you go on and on. Now, you could probably argue with either one of those points individually, but when you put those together as a body of evidence, there's no doubt that those were black people there. And they may not have been the whole population, but in terms of the governing body, the people that ran things,
they were there.
They were the dominant group. They were the royalty in ancient Sumer. You find the same thing in Iran. You find it in Afghanistan. You find evidences of black people as far away as Siberia.
Rashidi also believes the first people to settle the Americas wore black skin. He argues that early African man trekked through Asia, across the Bering Strait, and into the New World. But anthropologist Skelton says the first people settling the Americas came from a racial grouping he sees as neither black nor white.
Well, certainly the American Indians seem to be more closely related to the Asian peoples than directly to the blacks. So we would look at it in terms of people coming out of Africa to Asia, developing into what we call the Paleo-Mongoloid peoples, which were really more like American Indians than they are like modern Asians. In fact, a famous site, the Peking site, has some upper levels to it, and the people that are there, their crania look more American Indian than they do like the classical Orientals of the area today. And so we think that it's probably from these peoples that finally made it to Siberia, or maybe in fact were pushed there by more typical Asian peoples coming into the region that made it over to the Americas.
Wow. How then do you explain the Olmec heads? And who were those people? And where did they come from? And why do they look like me?
The Olmec heads are kind of an embarrassment in that they widely and for a long time been recognized as looking black. They don't look like the typical, we've all seen these Aztec figures with the long noses and very hatchet-faced people. The Olmec heads, on the other hand, are sort of wide and oblong and with flat noses and thick lips and you know, very black looking.
How do you explain them getting there?
I don't.
The Olmec civilization, which goes back to about 1500 BC, is the first what we call civilization in the Americas. And it wasn't an African civilization, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the Olmecs were black people, but that African people came to the Americas at a pivotal time in Olmec history. And they introduced, for example, how to move large objects in stone. They introduced calendars. They introduced agricultural science. All people traveled all over the world at various times. White people, black people, yellow people. But interestingly enough, African people, wherever they went, they brought things with them. They came bearing gifts that made fundamental contributions to the development and evolution of humanity. Unlike Europeans who usually came and took and exploited, Africans brought things with them. And as a result of that, wherever they went, they were given an honored place in their societies.
A place that has been forgotten in recent histories or erased.
It's been obscured,
right,
more than anything, because you can't really totally distort it. For example, in terms of the Olmecs, what scholars have been able to find, physical anthropologists, is when they dug up the graves of the Olmec cemeteries, the oldest ones, you find like 15 to 20% of the skeletal remains that are African in the royal cemeteries. And they're all male, which probably means that a small group of Africans came over here, coming out of Egypt and Nubia or Kush. They play a fundamental role, but there are only a few of them. And so that over a period of time, you find them intermarrying among the Indians themselves. And so that's another reason that it becomes obscured. because they came and they were profoundly effective and influential, but there were only a few of them. Now in Asia, it's just the opposite of that.
That's what I was
have
going to ask.
vast numbers of